The observation deck of the Meridian's Echo smelled faintly of recycled air, and the coffee someone had spilled near the environmental controls 3 weeks ago. No amount of cleaning had quite erased it. Lieutenant David Reyes had stopped noticing after the first month, but visitors always wrinkled their noses. Lyra hadn't. When she'd first stepped onto the deck, those long ears of hers had twitched twice, sampling the air, and she'd simply nodded as if cataloging the scent for some internal database labeled, "Human spaces smell like burnt beans and regret." That had been 4 months ago. Now she stood beside him at the main viewport, her reflection ghosting across the star field beyond, and David found himself wondering when exactly she'd stopped being a visiting diplomat and started being the person he looked for first thing every morning. "Explain again why your species decided to name an entire star cluster after a kitchen appliance," Lyra said, not looking at him. Her voice carried that melodic quality all Elori had, like someone was playing a cello very quietly behind her words. David followed her gaze to the percolator cluster, a dense collection of young stars burning blue-white against the darkness. Astronomers' sense of humor, it bubbles, sort of. If you squint and have been awake for 72 hours straight mapping gravitational anomalies. "Your species is deeply strange," says the woman whose people have a formal greeting that translates to "May your roots find water." "That is poetic. You're a spacefaring civilization. You don't have roots." Lyra's ears flicked in what David had learned was amusement. "Metaphor, David. I have been studying human language for 16 weeks now. I understand metaphor. Do you, though? Because yesterday you asked me why humans spill the beans when we reveal secrets, and you seemed genuinely concerned about bean-related accidents." She turned to face him fully, and David was struck again by how human she looked. If you covered her ears, if you ignored the slightly elongated proportions of her fingers, she could walk through any city on Earth without a second glance. Same basic architecture, same expressions playing across her face. Right now that expression was indignant. "Your idioms are aggressive and nonsensical. Last week your captain told someone to break a leg before a difficult task. I spent an hour researching human bone density, because I thought your species had weaponized encouragement." David couldn't help it. He laughed, the sound echoing off the curved walls of the observation deck. "I love that your first instinct was that we turned well-wishing into an extreme sport. Everything humans do seems like an extreme sport. You launch yourself into space on controlled explosions. You eat vegetables that evolved to be poisonous. You created a game where you throw balls at each other's heads and call it dodgeball, as if the violence is obvious from the name. To be fair, dodging is right there in the title. So is ball. You could have called it Run from Spherical Danger and been more honest." The morning briefing chime cut through their banter, a soft 3-note sequence that meant Commander Park wanted everyone's attention. David glanced at the chronometer on his wrist display. 0800 exactly. He should have been at his navigation console 5 minutes ago, running the daily drift calculations. Instead he'd been here, watching Lyra try to understand why humans named celestial objects after breakfast equipment. "We should go," he said, but neither of them moved. Through the viewport, the Elori home system was invisible, hidden somewhere beyond 47 light-years of empty space. The Meridian's Echo hung in the neutral zone, that carefully negotiated buffer between human expansion and Elori territory. 3 years since first contact, 4 months since this joint research mission began, 7 days until it ended. David hadn't let himself think about that last number very much. "I have been practicing," Lyra said suddenly. She squared her shoulders like someone preparing for combat. "Watch, I will use sarcasm correctly this time. Oh, this should be good. Your rubber duck is very helpful. I am certain it provides excellent debugging advice." David glanced at his console across the room, where a small yellow duck wearing a tiny helmet sat among the holographic displays. "Okay, delivery was solid, but you're supposed to sound more deadpan. You went too enthusiastic. Now it sounds like you actually think the duck is helpful. Is it not? It's a rubber duck, Lyra. Yes, but you talk to it when you are frustrated with navigation algorithms. Then you solve the problems. The duck must be contributing something. The duck contributes nothing. It's about explaining the problem out loud, forces you to think differently. Lyra's ears swiveled forward, a sign of intense concentration. So the duck is a psychological catalyst. The duck is a bath toy I stole from my nephew, which you use as a psychological catalyst. You're trying to make this make sense and it won't. That's the beauty of it. She was quiet for a moment, her reflection still visible against the stars. The percolator cluster bubbled silently in the distance, stars being born in clouds of hydrogen and cosmic dust. Somewhere out there, on one of the survey probes they'd launched last week, instruments were measuring radiation curves and magnetic field fluctuations. Cold, precise data. The universe reduced to numbers and wavelengths. David wondered what wavelength described the way his pulse kicked up whenever Lyra walked into a room. "I do not understand humans," Lyra said finally, but her tone was soft, almost fond. "But I think I am beginning to understand you." Before David could figure out what to say to that, his comm chirped. Commander Park's voice crackled through. "Rays, are you planning to navigate this ship today, or have you decided to become a full-time stargazer?" David tapped his comm. "Sorry, Commander, on my way. Had to explain kitchen appliances to our guest." "Of course you did, Park out." Lyra was already moving toward the exit, her movements fluid in the slightly lower gravity they maintained for Elori comfort. "Your commander has excellent hearing. Your commander once told mine that patience is bitter but its fruit is sweet, and Park spent 3 days convinced it was a threat. It is a proverb about wisdom. See, that's the kind of thing you should mention before dropping cryptic fruit metaphors on military officers." They walked together through the corridors of the Meridian's Echo, past crew members who barely glanced at them anymore. Human and Elori side by side. 4 months ago that would have drawn stares. Now it was just Tuesday, or whatever day it was. David had lost track somewhere around the 3rd week. Space did that to you. At the junction where the corridors split, Lyra paused. "Same time tomorrow. You were going to teach me dead reckoning. Navigation by pure calculation and desperation. Every pilot's favorite nightmare. You said it builds character." "I said it builds character the way falling builds an understanding of gravity." Her ears flicked again. Amusement. David was getting better at reading the micro-expressions. "I will bring the duck," she said, "for psychological catalysis." "Catalysis? That is what I said." She left before he could correct her again, disappearing down the corridor toward the linguistic analysis lab, where she spent most of her afternoons translating human literature into Elori. Last week she'd asked him what raining cats and dogs meant, and he'd made the mistake of trying to explain it. She'd spent 2 hours researching Earth's precipitation patterns, convinced there was some atmospheric phenomenon he was describing poorly. David watched her go, then headed to his navigation station. The rubber duck stared at him from its perch among the displays. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered. "I know." The duck, psychological catalyst that it was, remained silent. 7 days. The number sat in his chest like a stone. 7 days until the Elori delegation packed their equipment, their notes, their carefully catalogued observations about human weirdness and went home. 7 days until the Meridian's Echo returned to purely human operations. 7 days until Lyra walked out of his life and back to hers. 47 light years becoming an insurmountable distance measured not just in space, but in the difference between 2 civilizations still learning to trust each other. David pulled up the day's navigation charts and tried very hard not to count down. The scout vessel Tenacity had all the charm of a filing cabinet with engines. David had flown worse, but not by much. The interior was gunmetal gray. The seats were designed by someone who had apparently never encountered a human spine, and the coffee maker had been broken since the Carter administration. Which Carter administration remained a subject of debate among the crew. Lyra sat in the co-pilot seat, running her fingers over the manual controls with the careful attention of someone defusing a bomb. These interfaces are deliberately hostile. They're intuitive once you get used to them, David said, keying in the flight path to the Crimson Veil Nebula. The coordinates scrolled across his display in neat columns, a 3-hour journey through empty space to catalog some magnetic anomalies that would probably turn out to be nothing interesting. Intuitive, Lyra repeated, her tone flat. This toggle operates life support. This one operates waste reclamation. They are identical and adjacent. Yeah, you don't want to mix those up. This design philosophy explains much about human evolution. David glanced at her. She was trying not to smile, he could tell. Her ears were doing that slight forward tilt that meant she was pleased with her own joke. 4 months of watching her, and he'd become fluent in a language that had no words. The tenacity shuddered as they detached from the Meridian's echo, the gentle push of maneuvering thrusters giving way to the steady burn of the main engine. Through the forward viewport, stars wheeled and settled. The nebula hung in the distance like a bruise on the universe, all purples and deep reds, shot through with veins of luminescent gas. Beautiful, Lyra said quietly. Wait until we get closer. The electromagnetic interference plays hell with the sensors. You'll get to see me navigate by pure spite and mathematical stubbornness. Your species does seem to accomplish much through spite. It's one of our core values, right up there with curiosity and inventing new types of cheese. Lyra pulled up the mission parameters on her secondary screen. Her people had contributed the magnetic sensors, delicate instruments that could detect field fluctuations down to the femtosla. Humans had contributed the ship, and the pilot willing to fly into a region of space that looked like the universe had taken up watercolors after a bad day. Together, they were mapping phenomena that neither species could study alone. Cooperation in action, very inspiring. The propaganda videos practically wrote themselves. David wished he could stop thinking about the fact that this was one of their last missions together. I have a question about human courtship rituals, Lyra said, not looking up from her screen. David's hands stuttered on the controls. The tenacity dipped 3 degrees off course before he corrected. That's a hell of a topic change. Dr. Akafer was explaining the concept of dating to me yesterday. She said humans often share meals as a precursor to mate selection, but you and I share meals regularly. I am confused about the distinction. Context, David said, his voice coming out slightly strangled. Dating meals have different context. What context? Intention, interest, the understanding that it's romantic and not just 2 coworkers eating sandwiches in the commissary. How do you signal this understanding? Usually poorly and with great anxiety. Lyra finally looked at him, her head tilted in that way that meant she was analyzing something. You are uncomfortable. I'm not uncomfortable. Your voice increased in pitch by approximately 40 hertz, and you are gripping the controls with sufficient force to leave impressions. I'm fine, just concentrating on flying. We are traveling through empty space at a constant velocity. You entered the navigation coordinates 18 minutes ago. There is nothing to concentrate on. David took a breath. Outside, the stars hung in their ancient patterns, light that had traveled for years or centuries to reach his eyes. Some of those stars were probably dead already, burned out and gone dark, but their light kept arriving like letters from ghosts. Why are you asking about dating? Cultural research. Your mating rituals are complex compared to most species. Most species. The Ilori process is much simpler. If 2 people are compatible, they declare intent and negotiate terms. Very efficient. Sounds romantic. Romance is a human concept. We have compatibility assessments. Of course you do. David couldn't keep the smile out of his voice. Let me guess. Questionnaires, personality matrices. Do you rate each other on a scale? We discuss values, goals, and biological compatibility. Then we decide if we wish to build a life together. It is practical. It's depressing is what it is. Lyra's ears flicked back, almost defensive. How is your method superior? Dr. Akafer told me humans often engage in elaborate deceptions, misread signals, and experience what she called catastrophic anxiety over whether to initiate physical contact. She said her first date with her spouse involved both of them reaching for the same door handle and accidentally hitting each other in the face. David laughed despite himself. Okay, yeah, we're disasters, but at least we're interesting disasters. Inefficient disasters. Some things are worth being inefficient about. The nebula was growing larger now, filling more of the viewport. Up close it was even more spectacular, layers of ionized gas creating three-dimensional structures that looked almost architectural. David had seen the composite images, the enhanced data maps, but nothing compared to seeing it with your own eyes. Photons hitting retinas. Light becoming electricity becoming thought. The universe making itself known through meat and chemistry. They were halfway through the approach when the proximity alarm chirped. David frowned at his console. That's weird. Define weird in this context. We've got a debris field ahead. Small stuff, but dense enough to trigger sensors. Lyra pulled up the scan data. No debris was indicated in the preliminary survey. Maybe something broke up recently. Asteroid, old satellite, could be anything. I'm going to slow us down and plot around it. He was reaching for the throttle controls when the entire console went dark. For a moment there was only the hum of life support and the distant tick of cooling metal. Then emergency lighting flickered on, bathing everything in red. Please tell me that's a drill, David said. Navigation is offline, Lyra said, her voice remarkably calm. Communications offline. Primary and secondary power, showing critical failures across multiple systems. That's not a drill. No. David ran through the emergency checklist in his head, trying to remember if he'd ever actually studied what to do when everything stopped working at once. The nebula's electromagnetic field must be stronger than we thought, fried our systems. We are not inside the nebula yet. I know, that's the concerning part. They sat in the darkness, the tenacity coasting on momentum through space. Every system that kept them alive suddenly reduced to its most basic mechanical functions. David could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Lyra breathing beside him, steady and even. So, she said after a moment, what is the human protocol for imminent death in space? We're not going to die, probably. But your confidence is inspiring. Life support is still working. That's independent of the main power grid. We've got air, heat, and time to figure this out. How much time? David checked the mechanical chronometer on his wrist, one of those old-fashioned devices that didn't rely on electronics. Couple hours before anyone notices we're late checking in. Another hour before they can get a rescue team out here. So we've got maybe 6 hours total before this becomes a problem. Your definition of problem is generous. I prefer optimistic. David unbuckled and moved to the rear of the cabin where the manual access panels were located. The navigation relay is probably fried. If we can replace it, we can at least get basic systems back online. Do you have a replacement relay? We have a maintenance kit, should have spare components. Should have. Your skepticism is noted and unhelpful. Lyra joined him at the access panel, watching as he pried it open with a manual override tool. Inside was a nest of cables, junction boxes, and components that looked like they'd been installed sometime during the Bronze Age. David pulled out the diagnostic scanner, checked the battery, and was grateful when it flickered to life. Okay, here's the damage, he said, scanning the systems. The primary relay is dead. The secondary relay is in what I would call technically functioning but not enthusiastic about it condition. If we can boost the secondary and reroute power, we might be able to limp back to the Echo. Might, better than sitting here counting stars. They worked in the red emergency lighting, David calling out component locations, while Lyra's longer fingers navigated the tight spaces between cables. She was surprisingly good at this, her movements precise and methodical. When he mentioned it, she said Elori children learned basic engineering the way human children learn to read. We believe understanding the systems that sustain you creates responsibility, she said, carefully disconnecting a power coupling. We believe crossing our fingers and hoping things work creates character. Yes, I have noticed this about your species. An hour passed, then another. They jury-rigged a bypass, rerouted power through systems that were never meant to carry it, and generally performed the kind of desperate engineering that would make safety inspectors weep. The tenacity remained stubbornly dark. I think I have located the problem, Lyra said finally. She was wedged halfway into the access panel, only her legs visible. Her voice came out muffled. There is a secondary junction that appears to have melted. Melted, fused, thermally compromised. Whatever term makes you feel better about our situation. Can you replace it? If you have a spare J7 junction and approximately 30 minutes. David checked the maintenance kit. No J7 junction. He did find what looked like a J6 and a J8, which was either helpful or cosmically ironic. I've got two junctions that are almost the right. Almost? I'm starting to dislike that word in your voice. Lyra extracted herself from the panel, her usually neat hair disheveled, a smudge of something dark across her cheek. We could attempt to modify one of them to function. Define attempt. We will either restore power or create a small electrical fire, possibly both. Your optimism is inspiring. I learned from the best. They grinned at each other in the red light, two people alone in a broken ship surrounded by the infinite darkness of space, and David realized he couldn't think of anyone else he'd rather be stranded with. All right, he said. Let's make something explode. The observation lounge had been transformed into something that looked like a collision between a diplomatic reception and a particularly enthusiastic yard sale. Someone had strung lights across the ceiling that cycled through colors no human had names for, courtesy of Elori aesthetic sensibilities. The food tables groaned under the weight of dishes from two worlds, some of which were technically compatible with both species' biochemistry, others which came with small warning flags. David stood near the viewport nursing something that Lieutenant Park had assured him was mostly harmless, and watching Lyra navigate the crowd. She moved through the gathered humans and Elori with practiced grace, her long ears swiveling to track conversations, her posture perfect. Every inch the professional diplomat. He'd watched her do this dozens of times over the past 4 months, but tonight felt different. Tomorrow the Elori delegation would board their ship. Tomorrow this would all be over. He took a drink. Park had lied. It was extremely harmful. You look like someone canceled your birthday, Commander Park said, appearing at his elbow with the stealth that made her excellent at her job and terrible at parties. Cheer up, Rays. This is supposed to be a celebration. I'm celebrating. Can't you tell by my enthusiastic standing and drinking? You've been staring at the Elori linguist for the past 15 minutes. I'm observing cultural exchange. Is that what we're calling it? Park took a drink from her own glass, winced, and set it on a passing server drone. You know what your problem is. I'm sure you're about to tell me. You think too much. 4 months you've been dancing around this thing, whatever it is. Tomorrow she leaves and you'll spend the next year wondering what would have happened if you just said something. David finally looked at her. There's nothing to say. She's a diplomat on a mission. I'm a navigator. We work together, that's it. Right. And I'm the queen of Jupiter. Rays, I've watched you too. The way you orbit each other, the inside jokes, the fact that you know exactly where she is in any room without looking. That's not work colleagues. Even if that were true, what am I supposed to do? Walk up to her in the middle of a farewell party and say, hey, I know you're leaving forever, but I've developed complicated feelings about your existence. Yes, exactly that, maybe with better word choice, but yes, that's insane. That's honest. Park clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble. Think about it. What's the worst that could happen? She disappeared back into the crowd before David could point out that the worst that could happen was rejection, awkwardness, and 47 light-years of distance that would make forgetting impossible. He returned to his observation post by the viewport, watching stars and trying not to watch Lyra. The party continued around him. Ensign Kowalski was attempting to teach an Elori engineer the rules of poker with limited success. Someone had brought an actual guitar, and music was happening in the corner, a strange hybrid of human folk songs and Elori harmonic structures that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. Lieutenant Torres was deep in conversation with 3 Elori scientists, her hands moving as she described something that probably violated at least 2 laws of physics. David saw Lyra laugh at something Dr. Akafor said, her whole face transforming, and felt something twist in his chest. "Your beverage appears to be attacking you," said a voice beside him. He turned to find Lyra standing there, her head tilted in amusement. He'd been so busy watching her across the room he hadn't noticed her approaching. Smooth. Very professional. "The beverage is winning," he admitted. "I attempted one earlier. My medical assessment is that humans have impressive toxin tolerance. We've been building up an immunity to bad decisions for millennia." She moved to stand beside him at the viewport, close enough that he could smell whatever the Elori used for soap, something that reminded him of rain and ozone. Outside, the star field turned slowly as the meridian's echo maintained its rotation. The percolator cluster was visible again, still bubbling away in the distance, indifferent to diplomatic missions and feelings that had no business existing. "This has been a good mission," Lyra said quietly. "Has been past tense already. Tomorrow is past tense waiting to happen. That's almost poetic. You've been studying human literature too much. Or not enough." She was quiet for a moment, watching the stars. "I will miss this, the ship, the work, the conversations about rubber ducks and their psychological properties. The duck will miss you too. It's been more helpful since you started taking it seriously." "I do not take it seriously. You asked it for debugging advice yesterday. I was testing your methodology." "Sure." They stood in comfortable silence, the party noise fading to background static. David had spent hundreds of hours with Lyra over the past 4 months, but it had never been quite like this. Standing still. No work to do. No mission objectives. Just 2 people watching stars and pretending the universe wasn't about to put an insurmountable distance between them. "Can I ask you something?" David said before his brain could stop his mouth. "Of course." "Why did you volunteer for this mission? I know the official reason, cultural exchange and scientific cooperation and all that. But why you specifically?" Lyra's ears flickered in a pattern David couldn't quite read. "That is a complicated question. We've got time. Party's not ending anytime soon." She considered this, her fingers tracing patterns on the viewport's edge. "Do you know what my people thought when we first encountered humans? We thought you were doomed. A species that had nearly destroyed itself multiple times, that still fought wars over resources and ideology, that treated its own planet with casual violence. We thought you would burn out like a star-going supernova, bright and brief and ultimately self-destructive." Cheerful assessment. "But then we kept watching, and you kept not destroying yourselves. You kept reaching for the stars even when it seemed impossible. You kept creating art and science and ridiculous rubber duck debugging methodologies. You kept hoping." She turned to look at him directly. "I wanted to understand that. How a species could be so fragile and so stubborn at the same time. How you could know about entropy and futility and the heat death of the universe, and still bother making rubber ducks wear tiny helmets." David felt something unlock in his chest. "Did you figure it out? I am beginning to form theories. Care to share?" "Not yet. My research is incomplete." The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "Though I suspect the answer has something to do with spite. Everything good humans do has something to do with spite." "Yes, I am documenting this for my report. Behind them, someone had started a drinking game that appeared to involve throwing magnetic chips at a hovering target while reciting prime numbers. It was going poorly. Ensign Kowalski had just declared 17 was divisible by 3 and was being shouted down by multiple voices in multiple languages. "I attempted to learn sarcasm for you," Lyra said suddenly. "Did you notice?" "I noticed. Your delivery needs work. I practiced for hours, studied recordings, asked Dr. Akafer for coaching." "Why?" "Because it seemed important to you. Because your humor is a shield and I wanted to understand what you were shielding." She paused. "Because I wanted you to know I was paying attention." David's heart was doing something complicated and arrhythmic. "I'm going to miss you." "That is not sarcasm." "No, it's really not." They looked at each other, and David thought about all the conversations they'd never have, the nebulas they wouldn't survey together, the breakfast equipment they wouldn't name star clusters after. 4 months of carefully built familiarity about to be erased by distance and duty, and the fundamental reality that they were citizens of different worlds with different paths. "I should return to the party," Lyra said, but she didn't move. "Probably, my delegation leader will notice my absence." Almost certainly. Neither of them moved. The stars continued their ancient wheel. The party continued its cheerful chaos. Somewhere in the background, someone was trying to explain baseball to an Elori who kept asking why humans didn't simply calculate the optimal batting trajectory, and felt understanding slipping further away with each answer. "Lyra," David started, but she was already turning away. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "You promised to teach me dead reckoning. I don't think we'll have time tomorrow." "No, I suppose not." She smiled, and it didn't reach her eyes. "Good night, David." She said it in Elori, that word that meant both goodbye and until we meet in dreams, and David watched her disappear into the crowd. He stayed by the viewport until the party began winding down, until the lights cycled back to standard white, until the last few stragglers stumbled toward their quarters. Commander Park found him still standing there. "Did you talk to her?" "Yeah, and nothing. She's leaving tomorrow. Some things don't have solutions. Some things do if you're brave enough to look for them." Park studied him for a moment. "You know what your real problem is, Reyes? You're so busy navigating by the stars that you forget to look at what's right in front of you." She left him alone with that thought, and the viewport, and the slowly turning universe. David stared at the percolator cluster until his eyes hurt, trying to find something in those burning stars that looked like an answer. The cluster bubbled silently, indifferent to his problems, as useless as a rubber duck and twice as mocking. He went to bed sometime after midnight and didn't sleep at all. Departure day arrived with the mechanical precision of orbital mechanics. The Whisper of Home had docked at 0600, the Elori ship a sleek thing that made the Meridian's Echo look like a cargo hauler. David had watched it arrive on his console, tracked its approach vector, confirmed the docking sequence, and felt absolutely nothing. He'd gotten very good at feeling nothing over the past 8 hours. The hangar bays were controlled chaos, equipment being loaded, final systems checks being run, commanding officers exchanging formal farewells that would be recorded and archived and probably never watched by anyone. David threw himself into his assigned tasks with the focus of someone trying to outrun their own thoughts. Departure vector calculations, traffic control coordination, anything that required enough concentration to prevent his brain from wandering to places it shouldn't go. He was in Hangar Bay 3, running a diagnostic on a shuttle's navigation computer when he heard the footsteps. The bay was mostly empty, just him and a couple of maintenance techs working on the far side near the pressure doors. The sound echoed strange in the vast space, metal on metal getting closer. David didn't look up. If he didn't look up, if he kept his eyes on the diagnostic readout, maybe he could maintain the careful numbness he'd built around himself like armor. The footsteps stopped a few meters away. "You are difficult to locate when you are avoiding someone," Lyra said. David's hands stilled on the console. He looked up slowly. She stood there in her departure uniform, dark blue with silver threading that caught the hangar lights. A small travel pack was slung over one shoulder. Her ears were angled back slightly, uncertain. He'd never seen her look uncertain before. "I wasn't avoiding anyone," he said. "I was working. You were hiding in the least populated hangar bay running diagnostics on a shuttle that passed inspection yesterday. Maybe I'm thorough. You are many things. Thorough is not typically among them." Despite everything, David felt his mouth twitch toward a smile. Fair assessment. Lyra took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it and stopped. The distance between them felt both too much and not nearly enough. "I thought you might be at the main departure ceremony. Not really my scene. Too many speeches." "Yes." Commander Park spoke for 17 minutes about cooperation and shared futures. "I believe several people fell asleep." "That's Park. She considers brevity a personal failing." They fell into silence. Above them, the hangar bay's atmospheric processors hummed. Somewhere in the distance, metal clanged against metal. The whisper of home was scheduled to depart in 40 minutes. David knew because he'd checked the departure schedule roughly 600 times since waking up. "I brought you something," Lyra said suddenly. She reached into her travel pack and pulled out a small object wrapped in what looked like paper but probably wasn't, knowing a lorry manufacturing. "A farewell gift. Is that appropriate?" Dr. Okafor said gift-giving was customary, but then suggested I might be overthinking it, and I spent 3 hours researching human gift protocols, which only made me more confused. "You're rambling," David said gently. "I am aware." He took the package, unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small crystal, no bigger than his thumb, that seemed to hold light inside itself. It glowed faintly amber like a star captured mid-burn. "It is from my home," Lyra said. "We call them memory stones. They store light at a specific wavelength. That one holds light from the star my city orbits. I thought you might like to have a piece of Alori space for your collection." David held it up to the light, watching the way it seemed to pulse gently. "My collection. You collect strange things, rubber ducks, rocks from planets you have visited. That photograph of nebula that you think looks like a face but actually looks like ionized hydrogen in the process of star formation. It looks like a face. It looks like physics. A face made of physics." Lyra's ears flicked forward, amused despite herself. "I will miss these circular arguments." "They're not circular, they're spiraling, totally different geometric concept." "That is not better." David closed his hand around the crystal, feeling its slight warmth against his palm. "Thank you, really, I'll keep it with the duck. The psychological catalyst. The psychological catalyst." More silence. The hangar felt too big and too small simultaneously. David wondered if this was how the universe felt to photons, traveling for years across empty space just to arrive at a destination and be absorbed, all that journey ending in a moment. "Before I leave," Lyra said, her voice carrying a tremor he'd never heard before, "I want to ask you something." David's heart kicked against his ribs hard enough that he wondered if she could hear it. "Okay, it may be inappropriate. I have consulted cultural databases, and I am still uncertain about propriety." "Since when do you worry about propriety? You spent 3 weeks trying to convince Commander Park that direct emotional honesty was superior to what you called our exhausting human politeness protocols. This is different." "How?" Lyra looked at him, really looked at him, and David saw something in her expression that made his carefully maintained numbness crack straight down the middle. "Because the answer matters more than I anticipated it would when I began this mission." The maintenance techs chose that moment to leave, their voices echoing as they headed toward the exit. The hangar bay doors cycled open and shut. Then it was just the two of them in the vast space, surrounded by ships and equipment and the constant mechanical breathing of the station. "Ask," David said quietly. "In the human concept of dating, the meals where intention is signaled rather than ambiguous." Lyra started, speaking carefully like someone navigating a minefield. How does one determine if the other person shares the same understanding? How do you know if what you feel is reciprocated or if you are misreading cultural signals? Usually you just ask, or you panic and assume the worst. Humans aren't great at this. That is not helpful. I know. David set down the crystal carefully on the shuttle's console. Why are you asking me this, Lyra? Because I need to know if the past 4 months were cultural exchange or if they were something else. She took a breath. Because I need to know if I was the only one who started looking for reasons to extend mission briefings. If I was the only one who thought about conversations we had not yet had. If I was the only one who realized that 47 light years was not a distance but a disaster. David felt something give way inside him, some dam he'd built to hold back every feeling he'd been pretending not to have. You weren't the only one. Then why did you not say anything? Because you're leaving. Because you have a life 47 light years away and I have a life here and there's no solution to that problem. Because I didn't want to make your last days here complicated. They were already complicated. Lyra moved closer, close enough that he could see the way her hands were shaking slightly. Do you know what I told my delegation leader when she asked why I was volunteering to stay in this sector for an extra research cycle? You're staying. I requested a transfer to the Joint Research Station in the neutral zone. 6 more months, possibly longer if the diplomatic channels approve extended study. My delegation leader asked why I would delay returning home. Lyra's voice dropped. I told her my research was incomplete, that I still did not understand human resilience. She did not believe me. Why not? Because I am a terrible liar, and also because she has seen the way I return from navigation briefings. David laughed, the sound coming out startled and helpless. What way is that? Apparently I smile more than is appropriate for someone who has just spent an hour learning about stellar drift calculations. Those calculations are very smile-worthy. They are not. Maybe it wasn't the calculations. Lyra's ears were doing something complicated, cycling through patterns David had never seen before. I am trying to ask you something and you are being deliberately difficult. I learned from the best, David. He reached out and took her hand, feeling how her longer fingers curled around his. What are you trying to ask? If I stay. If I transfer to the research station for 6 months. If we are in the same sector, working on adjacent projects, sharing meals that may or may not have romantic intention depending on context. She trailed off, then started again. Would you be interested in determining experimentally if what we have is compatible, by human standards rather than Elori efficiency assessments? Are you asking me if I want to date you? I am using significantly more words than necessary, but yes, that was very human of you. I have been practicing. David felt the smile take over his entire face. Yeah, yes, absolutely yes. Though I should warn you, human dating involves a lot of miscommunication and anxiety. I have spent 4 months watching you talk to a rubber duck. I am prepared for human chaos. And sarcasm. You'll have to keep working on your sarcasm. I will practice diligently. Lyra squeezed his hand. You are certain? Because Elori commitment protocols require clear verbal confirmation of intent, and I do not want to assume based on nonverbal cues even though you are currently exhibiting approximately 12 signs of positive emotional response. I'm certain, though I'm curious what the 12 signs are. Elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, increased smile duration, and 9 others I will explain later when you are not attempting to deflect vulnerability with humor. That's not fair. Deflecting vulnerability with humor is my primary personality trait. I know. I wrote it in my cultural observation notes. They stood there holding hands in the middle of Hangar Bay 3, surrounded by ships that could travel faster than light, in a station that orbited between star systems, representatives of 2 different species trying to figure out something as old and complicated as wanting someone to stay. Above them, through the bay's observation ports, stars burned in their ancient patterns. I should go, Lyra said, not moving. The whisper of home departs in 31 minutes and my delegation leader will notice if I am absent. Probably, I will transfer my belongings to the research station within the week. I'll help. I know a guy with a shuttle. You are the guy with a shuttle. Even better. Lyra reached up and touched his face, her fingers careful against his cheek. Thank you. For what? For making rubber ducks seem profound. For teaching me navigation techniques that are held together by spite. For showing me that humans are stubborn enough to make impossible things work. We're pretty good at that, David admitted. She kissed him then, quick and careful, and stepped back before he could respond. That was appropriate, yes. Dr. Ackhaffer said physical affection was acceptable once intent was established. You talked to Ackhaffer about this. I talked to everyone about this. Your crew is invested in our relationship to a concerning degree. They're going to be insufferable when they find out you're staying. Good. They can celebrate while we determine if we are compatible. Lyra picked up her travel pack, adjusted it on her shoulder. Same time tomorrow. You still owe me a lesson in dead reckoning. Navigation by pure calculation and desperation. It sounds romantic when you describe it that way. Everything sounds romantic when you're not trying to avoid asteroids. She left, her footsteps echoing across the hangar, and David watched her go with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The memory stone still sat on the console, glowing its captured starlight. He picked it up, held it next to his comm unit where the small rubber duck maintained its vigil. Don't look at me like that, he told the duck. I know I'm being optimistic, but sometimes spite and stubbornness are enough. The duck, wise psychological catalyst that it was, had no comment. David pulled up the shift schedule on his console and started calculating how many navigation briefings he could reasonably justify over the next 6 months. The answer was a lot, possibly too many, definitely enough. Outside the hangar bay, the whisper of home undocked on schedule, carrying its delegation back toward Elori space. David watched it go on his display, tracking its departure vector out of professional habit and personal sentiment. 47 light years had seemed insurmountable yesterday. Today it was just distance. And humans, Lyra had learned, were very good at being stubborn about distance.